Hi, my name is Isan Taylor with I Love the Berg, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our next installment of the History Half Hour. These free history tours are made possible in part by the city of St. Petersburg. We're about to get started with today's host, Monica Kile, who's live at 13th Street and 2nd Ave North. Her husband, John Kile, is going to be running the slideshow for us today. Tonight, you'll see a mix of live footage and slides with historic photos, and we hope you enjoy. If you have a question during our live tour, please feel free to use the comments section. We're going to do our best to work in as many questions during the live tour as possible. Once again, thank you for joining us. Be sure to follow I Love the Berg on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, as well as subscribing to our newsletter to stay up to date on our next history tour, the latest news, exclusive deals, and all things good in the Berg. Monica, over to you.
All right, cool. Thank you, Isa. Again, thanks to the city of St. Petersburg, Dex Fabian, who's filming behind the camera. My husband, John Kile, is going to be both showing slides and providing commentary as well. As Isa said, I am standing on 13th Street and 2nd Avenue North on the edge of a neighborhood known as Methodist Town and later renamed Jamestown. It's a neighborhood I think a lot of people in St. Pete don't know much about. It's one of the historically African-American neighborhoods here in the city. But again, one that I don't think people know a lot about, and that's because it was virtually completely eradicated in the late 1970s with a public housing project and a spur of the interstate that came into downtown St. Pete. So we're going to hopefully open up a little bit of that history to you today. And we're also going to be delving into a little bit of our early Jewish history in the city, because not only was Methodist Town home to a large population of African-American residents, there were also on the outskirts, sort of interspersed throughout the neighborhood, a fair number of Jewish residents too. So we're going to talk about that. I want to touch on sort of a note about cultural sensitivity here. I'm neither African American nor Jewish, and so I know that I'm coming at this topic from an outside perspective. John and I have tried to be very sensitive when unearthing these stories and choosing what we would talk about, because we neither want to appropriate or exploit anyone's race or culture for entertainment purposes. That's not where we're going for here. But there's a lot of stories here that I think people don't know. And when putting this tour together, we kept coming back to sort of the mission of this series of tours, which is really to show people an area of town that they may not otherwise be familiar with, and tell them a little bit about how we got to be the city of St. Pete that we are today. So that's our goal today. Please feel free, if I say something that's incorrect, send that into me via comments. We did a lot of deep digging. We went on a lot of tangents. There are so many interesting things you can discover when researching the history of Methodist Town. Some really upsetting things, some really fascinating things. I went off on all kinds of tangents about segregation, not just in housing, but in education. I delved down rabbit holes of music history and church history, and there's just all kinds of tangents we went off on, and I hope that this tour will inspire some of you to maybe look into some of those things as well, and we'll tell you some resources where you can do that at the end of the tour. So John, do me a favor and pull up the map and show them where we are today, so then get a sense of where in the city I am.
Yeah, this first map is a satellite view of St. Petersburg. You've got the pier on the far right side of the map, 275 and 375 on the left side of the map. And this yellow box kind of denotes what was Methodist Town before it was redeveloped. Originally, Methodist Town actually extended all the way out to 16th Street, but eventually that side of Methodist Town really became all white, and the all black section of Methodist Town bordered between First Ave North, really Burlington or Arlington, and Fifth Ave North, and Martin Luther King, and right around 12th Street. This second map is going to kind of give us an idea of where Monica is going to go today. She's starting here right where 13th and 2nd Avenue North are. She's going to wind over to Burlington. She's going to walk up through that Jamestown neighborhood and go through past a couple of sites, including some churches. She's going to talk a little bit about the Jewish history and some of the businesses that were on 9th Street, now Dr. Martin Luther King Street, and then circle around to some more churches, as well as finishing off with some Jewish history. And we've got a lot to pack in, so I'm going to turn it back over to her. if she is ready.
Yeah, we're going to cover a lot. We may be a little over half an hour. But as I said, I'm standing on the edge of Methodist Town, and Methodist Town really got started in the late 1800s. The railroad came in 1888. With the railroad came a lot of black laborers who began to reside in neighborhoods, one known as Peppertown, here Methodist Town, an area known as the gas plant. We touched on that a little bit when we did our Edge tour a month or two ago. And Methodist Town is so named for the church, which we're going to see later in the tour, the Bethel Ame African Methodist Episcopal Church. That's where the name Methodist Town came from. And that church was built in 1894. So the area started to develop around it. It was full when the housing development opened in 1975, the Jamestown Public Housing Complex. They had relocated about 1,200 families out of Methodist Town. So that gives you a sense of the population that was in this either several block area at that time. Mostly Black families that were moved out when the public housing complex was put in. If you look, Dex, that way, you can see 2nd Avenue North, just in front of that brick building there. That's 2nd Avenue North. You'll notice it does not continue across the street. This is 13th Street we're standing on. 2nd Avenue North does not continue across the street. It dead ends into this housing complex behind us. That's because they removed 2nd Avenue North through Methodist Town when they started building. Immediately behind me are subsidized housing for senior citizens. These were built, these particular ones were built in the 80s. There's a tall tower we'll see in a minute that was built in 1968. Those are sort of a precursor to the public housing complex that comes later. But 2nd Avenue used to continue through all the way down basically to Mirror Lake. Sitting on 2nd Avenue facing that direction was a famous hotel called the Robert James Hotel, which became really well known in the Black community in the 50s and 60s because it housed Black travelers, Black tourists, but also all the Black entertainers and baseball players who were not allowed to stay in the white hotel. So people like Dizzy Gillespie and Duke Ellington, when they came to play at the Manhattan Casino and could not stay in the Vinoy or the Sereno, other white hotels. The Black baseball players that came with the Yankees for spring training, or the Cardinals, could not stay in the team hotel, the Vinoy, the Sereno, where the Yankees were staying. And so they would stay in places like the Robert James. It was owned by a dentist named Robert Swain, who was really a lion in St. Pete history. He had a large part in the desegregation, not just spring training, but residential desegregation in the city as well. He pushed the color line. There was an unspoken and really probably spoken to boundary at 15th Avenue South, between 5th Avenue and 15th Avenue South, where Blacks were supposed to be living on the south side, and Blacks were not allowed to build beyond that 15th Avenue South line. Robert Swain built his dentist office just across the street from 15th Avenue South. The city didn't want to give him a permit, and he got a lawyer and threatened to sue, and they caved. So that's really how the residential segregation barriers began to topple when Robert Swain did that. He also almost single-handedly desegregated spring training by refusing to continue to house the Black baseball players. He basically said, I can't argue against segregation on the one hand here and then continue to house these Black ball players and make this easy for these team owners. So he refused to house them. The Yankees pulled out of spring training in St. Pete, and very quickly spring training was desegregated after that. So he owned the Robert James Hotel behind me. It was also the location of the broadcast of WIOK radio station, which was a Black radio station hosted by DJ Goldie Thompson. John will show you a picture of that in just a minute. So this was right on the edge of Methodist Town. Just across the street, we'll give us our first glimpse of our Jewish history. This brick building right beyond that police car right there. It's been painted white on the front. This building was built in 1923 as a storefront, and was quickly rented out to what became the Congregation B'nai Israel. So the first Jewish congregation in St. Pete. They had just reached I forget what the word is, but essentially a quorum of 10 families that they needed to have services, and started their services here in this building in 1923 and held their services there until 1926. Before that, they had going over to Tampa to worship. So in 1923, there were just 10 Jewish families living in the city. Historians believe that the first Jewish resident of the city came here in 1901. His name was Henry Schutz, and he owned a dry goods store on Central Avenue. He came to the U.S. in 1883 from Germany. He originally lived in Savannah, and came here in 1901, opened his dry goods store, was very well liked. The St. Petersburg Times in 1902 referred to him as one of our popular merchants, or 1910, excuse me. They wrote about his marriage to Emma Fleischman of Baltimore. Schutz ultimately sells his dry goods store on Central Avenue, which was in the 500 block. John, I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. He eventually sells it to Woolworth in 1929, and it becomes the Woolworth on Central Avenue, and then later the Dome Grill. So we'll see that in just a few minutes. So in 1920, there's only 10 Jewish families living here. Historians call them the original 10. They were all families of Eastern European origin, and they all lived or worked basically within the city's central business district. So kind of we're sort of on the outskirts of the central business district now. So we're going to be talking more about them as we move through the neighborhood. John, we're going to walk further into Methodist Town. Do you want to show those pictures that we have? John? Issa and John, I can't hear anything.
His audio is going out for a second. So
Yeah, I was
there he
muted,
is.
and then
Okay.
my toolbar was blocking the mute button. This is live stuff here.
You're doing
So,
great, John.
yeah,
Because you scared
Here
me.
we go.
I'm here.
Thought the kids had kidnapped you.
So the first picture here is the first president of the B'nai Israel congregation, and there's a picture of that same building. Obviously, you can see that the front has been painted white over the years, but just a great shot there. And here's an ad from 1902 from the St. Pete Times with Schutz's store advertising Christmas goods. And obviously, with only 10 Jewish families in town, they were not catering to a Jewish clientele at that time. And so they were offering their Christmas goods. And as Monica said, you might recognize this building that he sold to Woolworths. You've probably, if you've been around long enough, maybe remember the Woolworths, or you ate breakfast there when it was the Dome Grill, which was a very, very popular breakfast spot for a long time here in St. Pete. And that building is getting worked on now. Here are a couple of shots of the Robert James Hotel. Late 1950s, 1960 is when it went up for sale. And then a great ad for announcing Goldie Thompson when he came to be the DJ at the very popular black radio station. Robert Swain, again, Monica said he was just an enormous figure in the neighborhood, or black, white, either way. He had a big impact on baseball. You might wonder where we're getting some of this information. And one of the great resources was a census that was done in 1938, commissioned really in the name of urban renewal to see who was living in Methodist Town. And there are just hundreds and hundreds of pages of these surveys that were done to see who was renting, who was owning property in Methodist Town. How much did they pay for rent? How much did they pay for utilities? How much did they pay for groceries? How much did they earn? What was their job? It's hundreds and hundreds of pages, not searchable, so you really have to go through page by page, but there's so many stories to find in there. And I'm going to just end on a photo of Dwight Jones, because Monica is she's a fast walker, so she's probably already at the Dwight Jones Center.
No, we're just out to cross the street there, but I'm glad you showed that picture of that survey, because I intended to say that this neighborhood started to grow in the late 1880s, 1890s, and already by the 1930s, you'll find references in the newspaper that the city's trying to clear it through what they call slum clearance programs, and those were really spurred by a 1937 act of Congress called the Wagner Steagall Act, I think is what it's called, where basically the federal government made a lot of funding available for what they called slum clearance. And eventually the city of St. Pete is able to leverage that funding into building Jordan Park down on the south side. But also they end up building what becomes the Jamestown complex that we're really standing right now. So Dwight Jones, we're standing in front of the Dwight Jones Neighborhood Center, which is part of the Jamestown housing complex. And it's named after a young man who was born here in Methodist Town in 1950. As a child, he was full of ambition. He was on the track team in high school. He organized the St. Petersburg High Black Culture Organization. He went to St. Pete College and then on to the University of West Florida. Jones was really interested in the children of Methodist Town and of St. Pete. He founded the Black Brothers and Sisters of the North Side with his brother Reginald and his childhood friend Goliath Davis, who we'll talk more about shortly. Dwight Jones liked to tutor children, and they set up kind of a makeshift community center and a store at 3rd Avenue South and Jackson Street, just over this way, where he would set up basketball games for kids, plan field trips for them. He would tutor them. A neighbor remembers that Jones had really very little time for himself. He'd come home from school, throw his books down on the counter, and head over to the community center with just a sandwich in one hand and a book for a child in the other. When the John Knox apartments, Dex, turn around and film this John Knox apartments on the other side of the street here. You can see this. It's not called the John Knox apartments anymore, but this big tower complex was it's basically government subsidized senior housing for effectively low-income seniors. When this was being built in 1968, Dwight Jones kind of looked to his friend Go Davis and said, well, if they're building this housing for old people, why can't they help us with our housing? And they began to advocate in front of the council for better housing. A lot of the housing in Methodist Town was owned by white absentee landlords who were not taking care of the properties. As John said from that 1937 survey, we know what the people in Methodist Town were doing for jobs. We know what they were making and what they were paying for rent, and their landlords just weren't taking care of the property. So the residents of Methodist Town began advocating for better housing. Dwight Jones was a big part of that. Goliath Davis says, Dwight always felt like he was going to have time for himself when he got all his work done. And that never came to pass because Dwight Jones was drafted into Vietnam and was killed within weeks of getting out of basic training in a Viet Cong attack. His mother wanted to bury him in the Royal Palm Cemetery and was refused because he was Black. And so 9 years after his death, the community center in the newly built Jamestown neighborhood complex was named after Dwight Jones. So some success there. We just walked down Burlington Avenue, and this was sort of one of the main business districts in this neighborhood, Burlington here. There's almost nothing on it now because most of these businesses were eradicated. We know that by 1950, there were at least 68 businesses operating in Methodist Town, most of them Black or Jewish owned. We'll talk more about their eradication later, but now Burlington is really just sort of these remnants, of public housing complex, and no business activity to speak of. And John's going to talk more about that later. Behind me is the Jamestown, part of the Jamestown housing complex. These are the townhouses were built. This would have been the location of a sort of sub neighborhood called Bolita Alley, which was named after a ball, like a lottery type ball numbers game that was commonly played here. And that section of Methodist Town was frequently cited in arguments for the slum clearance that needed to be done here. John's going to show you some pictures of what Bolita Alley and the rest of Methodist Town looked like as we walk through to one of the few remaining landmarks in the neighborhood.
Yeah, so this first one is taken from the Times in 1961, and it says it's called Bolita Alley. It says a breeding ground for vice and crime. This really exemplifies the sort of language and the attitude that the neighborhood was portrayed both by public officials and in the media. They always talked about it being crime-ridden. Just a lot of language that you would really be shocked by today. I'm going to just kind of really quickly go through a few pictures from that era. And again, there were a lot of times they were taken in order to show poor conditions and not necessarily the better sides of the neighborhood. And they just it was a campaign in the public eye in order to discredit the better aspects of the neighborhood.
That's right. And John, the reason that was done is because in the 1920s, we have a huge boom in real estate. Our population goes from like 10,000 to like 40,000 in the 1920s. And there's a concerted effort on the part of the city to kind of move the Black residents south of Central Avenue. In fact, in the 1930s, they added language to the charter that tried to restrict Blacks to the southern part. So if you weren't here in town working, then and you're Black, then you shouldn't be here after dark, basically. So even though there was a very vibrant community life happening in Methodist Town, that doesn't show up in the newspaper very often because there was really a concerted effort to move this area out of here. So what is reflected in the newspaper is not always reality of what was happening. And we know that from the great work of historians like Rosalie Peck and John Wilson and people like Goliath Davis who grew up in the neighborhood and talk about what it was really like. We're standing in front of one of the few remaining buildings, really the only remaining buildings in Methodist Town are churches. And I have yet to get a good count on how many churches there originally were, but there's 3 or 4 still standing in Methodist Town now. This one was built in 1931. It was St. Paul's Baptist Church. It's now a Bulgarian Eastern Orthodox church. Across the street over this way, and this is 11th Street here, but you can see again it dead ends, so they cut the thoroughfares. Across the street towards sort of the end, you can see down that way, that was another church built in 1955, St. Mark's Missionary Baptist Church. This is 3rd Avenue here. Again, they dead end it where it originally would have gone through. Across the street, somewhere located on this side of the street, would have been a grocery store owned by Louis or Louis Cohen, also known as Louis Boston, because he was from Boston originally. He's an interesting person, one of those first original 10 Jewish families here in St. Petersburg. He arrived in St. Pete in 1917. He was part of the congregation B'nai Israel. He originally sold fruit from a pushcart on Central Avenue. Later, he had a small bakery and deli where the Sereno Hotel later stood on Beach Drive, where one of the condo towers is now. He later owns a shoe repair shop and an apartment house up near 7th Avenue, so a little north of where we are. But by 1937, he has a 2-story building here. He has an apartment on top and a grocery down below. You have to wonder, so during the decades of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, there's a sharp rise of anti-Semitism in St. Petersburg and really the country as a whole. And you have to wonder if Louis Cohen has been sort of effectively moved off of Beach Drive into a place where he was able to buy property and open a business. We don't have that anywhere in writing or sort of making some of those deductions, but it's very common, particularly in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, to see much more Jewish ownership in this neighborhood and along Burlington Avenue and 9th Street. So while the restrictions against Jews were nowhere near as tight as they were on African Americans, there were restrictive covenants in the residential areas. Almost all of the civic associations and religious organizations had what they called restricted clienteles. Many of the hotels, the Don Cesar on the beach, the Vinoy, were for Gentiles only. John's going to show you a few ads in a moment of apartment complexes and hotels in downtown that clearly stayed in their advertisements, Gentiles only, in the 1930s and 40s. So there's this symbiosis almost between the Jewish community and the Black community able to do business here in this neighborhood. So I wanted to also mention in the 1920s, the secretary of the Chamber of Commerce was a man named Jim Coad. And in the late 1920s, mid 1920s, 24, 25, signs popped up on 4th Street when you were coming off Gandy Bridge, very large signs that said, when you're coming into St. Pete, Gentiles only wanted, no Jews here. And it's believed that Jim Coad from the Chamber of Commerce had something to do with those signs. He later states very publicly in a speech Let me find the quote here. He says, in a speech in 1925, the time has come to make this 100% American and Gentile city, as free from foreigners as from slums. And he says this publicly in a speech. He's also believed to be one of the founding members of the St. Pete Clavern of the KKK, which was one of the most active of the Claverns in Florida. So he's believed to be one of those founding members as well. He was sort of publicly disavowed some of his statements by the business community, but he was also promoted to be the vice president of the Chamber of Commerce. So, it was frowned upon. Don't say that so loudly, but in reality, those sentiments were embraced by a proportion of the St. Pete community. And I don't think we think of St. Pete as that type of a place now. John, we're going to walk down to Bethel Ame if you want to show those next pictures.
Yeah. So this first one is a slide of Louis Boston's Beach Drive deli that was and bakery, which was very popular. Louis Boston died suddenly, and he was a big character. At one point, he was sentenced to like 6 months in jail for violating his liquor license. He was known in town. Everybody knew him. He'd had businesses all over the place. When he died, this article over here on the right-hand side was on the front page of the St. Pete Times. So he was a big figure in town. Shifting gears somewhat abruptly, as some people will recognize this structure from 8th Street, which is a very cool looking apartment building. I think it was the Glory Apartments, I think was what was it called?
The Glory. Yes.
Yeah. You can see the ad here in red when it was originally opened, Gentiles only. And this next page, just a sampling of other, the Mayflower Hotel, Paulson Apartments, Gentiles only, very prominently listed in there. And this is the front page of a 1937 St. Pete Times. And we don't think of St. Petersburg today as being this real southern city. But in 1937, St. Petersburg was firmly in the south. And really quickly, as Monica's, have you arrived at your next location?
Almost, not quite.
Okay. I'm going to throw up 2 quick slides showing the exhaustive research that John Wilson did, where he went through what is called the Polk city directories and plotted out where all of the African-American families were residing in St. Petersburg. 1920, you can see they all are above 5th Avenue South in the gas plant and Methodist Town areas. Methodist Town is actually going to kind of shrink. The gas plant still houses a lot of African-American families, but you can see the city is basically forcing African-Americans to live south of 5th Avenue through restrictive rental and ownership laws. And this is all deduced from these city directories. And I'll show this really quick. This first page, this first column, 1926, you'll see this is just an average list of names by their address. This is 13th Street, and these are all the addresses on the far left-hand side. On this next one, you'll start to see a lot of these have asterisks, and that asterisk in 1926 meant that was a black or colored family. And the line is stark. On one side of 9th Street, now MLK, on the east side was all white. On the other side was all black, and there was virtually no mixing on either side. In 1940, that notation was changed to a little parentheses with the letter C. And, it shows the level and overtness of the racism that existed in that time.
Perfect. Thank you, John. We're standing in front of the Bethel Ame Church, which gave the Methodist Town neighborhood its name. So the AME stands for African Methodist Episcopal Church. And this was the first Black organized religious denomination in America. It traces its history back to Philadelphia in 1787. This is one of the rabbit holes I went down. It's really fascinating how it, particularly after the Civil War, this denomination spread kind of like wildfire throughout the particularly in the South. But so this congregation was started here in 1894 by Reverend J.S. Braswell. They built their first sanctuary here on this spot. It was a small wooden sanctuary. In 1905, the congregation has grown. They build a stone church, a masonry building, which becomes known as the Stone Church, in the same location. By 1922, as the population in St. Pete rises, they need to go even larger. So they build this brick building essentially around the stone church. So the remnants of the stone church are still in there. They say they only missed one Sunday services because they were able to keep going while they were building the church. So it's a Gothic revival style building, which we don't have very many of here in St. Petersburg. And it was modeled after the mother congregation, Bethel Ame in St. Petersburg. And this was really one of the hearts of the African American community, not just in Methodist Town, but throughout the city. When we were doing our research, I'm going to walk down to 9th while I keep talking. While we were doing our research, one of the best sources, in addition to the city directories, is the what they call Negro news pages of the St. Petersburg Times, which was a whole section about Black news. And I often thought to myself, how could you be reading the newspaper, come across these sections, and then enact these laws against these people who have these lives just like you and I? It's their weddings and their church services. And then I realized they didn't run those sections in the white parts of town. So that Black section of the newspaper was only printed in the Black parts of town. So only Black people were seeing the stories about Black people. We're coming up now onto 9th Street, which is later renamed Martin Luther King Boulevard. And this was another of the business districts. We had 9th Street, we had 3rd Avenue, which is actually what we're walking down onto 9th. And then you had Burlington. So that's where the businesses were located. This to our right, I don't know how good of a shot you can get of it, was this the Dew car dealership, John?
Yeah, it was originally
the
original
car
Dew
dealership.
location. That building, I think, was 1923 and was a series of Chevrolet dealerships before it became a furniture store.
And then this one here at 276 was Brown's Service Garage, like Brown's Motor Company. Then it becomes the Clark Brothers Poultry Market, which we found a fabulous advertisement of with all kinds of chickens. And then we come upon the famous Coney Island Grill, which I'm embarrassed to admit I've actually never eaten at. And I know I'm going to get my St. Pete historian card taken away from me because I've never eaten at the Coney Island Grill. It's really an institution here in St. Pete. It's been open since 1925 or 1926. It has sort of an interesting footnote. A lot of people, I think, are familiar with the story of there being a window on the one side of the building. I'm not sure if it's on this side or on the back side, where the Black patrons would be served. We discovered in our research that actually in, what year was that, John? 1960, 67 or 68. Yeah. They were actually taken to court for not seating their Black patrons. So, and the owner actually is quoted in the paper as saying, well, I'll serve them. I just won't seat them in my restaurant because they cause trouble, basically, was the argument. He ends up caving, and the lawsuit goes away because he agrees to begin seating Black patrons. So sort of an interesting footnote to that famous restaurant, it's right here on the edge of a almost exclusively Black neighborhood. The next building here is now this Planet Retro Records this was a package store, a liquor store owned by Ben Green, another Jewish store owner who also owned the most famous Jewish delicatessen in the city, Ben Green's Deli. He later ends up selling this to Wilson's, the round liquor store on 4th Street. And then we get to, and actually we're going to turn here, but we'll show this building real quick on the corner of Burlington. This was the OK Market. It was a grocery store. Later it became a furniture store. But this was owned by the Hankin family, which is one of the first 10 Jewish families in the city. So you can see there's this real mix of sort of white and Black ownership. Dex, film the other side of the street real quick. This building we know today is the St. Petersburg Health Department, which has this mid-century look to it. This was the Sears Roebuck, and we can turn this way, Dex. The building was originally built in 1926 and then became the Sears Roebuck in 1929 and was added onto and then significantly renovated in 1949 to give it that sort of mid-century look we think of now. So if you're ever at the health department, you're standing in the old Sears Roebuck. John, we're going to go around the corner to the 10th Street Church of God. Ow! Ooh, ow! Stickers.
You all right?
Sorry. Yes, there was a really sharp sticker that grabbed me. Dex, film over here. It's going to be one of our last. We have this side and one more. We're coming up the backside of the 10th Street Church of God, with another congregation here in Methodist Town. It's got an interesting story. It's the second oldest wooden building in St. Peter, maybe wooden church. First is an Episcopal church down on 34th Street. But this building was moved here. It was originally built in 1898, I believe. Yeah, 1898. For the first Presbyterian church congregation, which was a white congregation in the old Northeast. When they built a new church, they donated this to the 10th Street Church of God, and it was moved here around 1913. It's now a designated local historic landmark, and there's been some discussion about its fate. Some of these buildings behind us, actually, John and I were walking the other day doing some research for this tour, and we met the developer who we had met before, we know, that's bought this property and several others in Methodist Town. And he invited us in. We walked around the warehouse and heard a little bit about some of his plans for this this part of town, which were interesting. It'll be interesting to see. This area is once again changing. You can see this over here, Dex. This is another one of the senior housing complexes that was built in the 60s and 70s. And as I walk, we're going to go around the corner. We're going to cross over 9th Street. And as I do so, I kind of wanted to put a bow, tie up Methodist Town, because we're leaving Methodist Town proper. And I think we did a lot of research on this. I think a lot of us have heard a fair bit about the gas plant neighborhood, particularly of late as the redevelopment of Tropicana Field is looming. I don't think as many people know that there was sort of a similar story that happened here in the Methodist Town area. This really destruction of this historically African-American neighborhood, not just for the public housing complex that went in, but also the spur of the interstate that comes in. Very common, both of these things, this urban renewal, which is kind of a euphemism for slum clearance, and these interstate spurs that really decimated a lot of Black communities throughout the United States. And the residents of Methodist Town had really long advocated for better housing. The feeling I got after reading exhaustively about this was there was a bit of a bait and a switch here. They did want better housing. I don't know that they wanted to be completely removed from their neighborhood. John, do you have any comments on that as we cross 9th Street here?
Yeah, I've got a photo of Chester James. We've mentioned how Methodist Town now is known as Jamestown, and Chester James his story kind of exemplifies the story of Methodist Town to Jamestown. He came to St. Pete in 1911. He worked a wide variety of jobs from carpentry to doorman, and he got acquainted with some names that we might know: C. Perry Snell, George Gandy, when he did some yard work for them. And he was an early advocate for Methodist Town, trying to get street and sidewalk improvements. In the 1960s, he marched with the city's well-known sanitation workers strike, and he received an award from Lyndon Johnson for registering over 1,000 voters. And when the city approached him in 1974 about naming him the honorary mayor of Methodist Town, he took it as that, an honor. But the redevelopment that was described to him involved low-cost loans to improve properties in the community, so they would loan you money so you could fix up your home, not gutting it. And it was something he later regretted when he realized that nearly 400 families would be removed from their homes. He's quoted as saying, "I never understood that you intended to take my home. I would have never voted for it. I would have never wanted to get rid of it. We've got nice homes out here. And it really was a situation where the people who were moved out were not the people who got housing in there. There was no priority given to people from Methodist Town. Oh, it would almost have been an accident if somebody who lived there ended up living in there again. There were a few, but it was not. That was not what happened. Do you want me to read those other two quotes really quick, Mon?
Yeah, go ahead,
Yeah.
because I think it's I hate to say instructive because it sounds almost patronizing, but when we talk a lot now in the city about the gas plant, I do think it's helpful to hear those quotes.
Yeah. Lest we start to think that these were the unintended consequences of well-intended people. When they were working on the gas plant project, they asked one of the city planners if they had learned any lessons from Methodist Town, and he said, "I don't know that we necessarily learned any lessons. Our experiences in Jamestown were very good, given what we knew about the area and what the city wanted to achieve." He's basically saying, this is 1979. He's saying, what we did was what we wanted to do. And this other is a quote from one of the residents in the gas plant where they ended up putting the baseball stadium. And I'm a baseball fan. I love the Rays. The Rays were not even a thing then. He said, "We thought all along that the city intended to use the government's money to subsidize the construction of an industrial park. But the thing that hurts us is that they used the condition of our houses as a pretext to get it. But the truth is out now." This is Eddie Burney. "Building better housing for us is not the main thrust of the plan. That's why they're going to build the housing after we've been relocated somewhere else." And here's that housing that was built. And eventually then they just said that they would make it light industry. And then they eventually put a baseball stadium there. And that is one reason that this is such a big deal in the discussion of the redevelopment of Tropicana Field, is that there were promises made to the community, to people who are, still living and working in this community, as to what would happen there and how it would benefit that community that lost their homes. And that is why this is such a major topic of discussion right now in St. Petersburg.
Yeah. Thank you, John. I think you and I talked about this before. It's easy to come away from studying this stuff and be a little bit cynical, but then I have to remind myself of when I first heard about Methodist Town was about 20 years ago when I first moved to St. Pete, and I was a graduate student, and I was given the job. I worked at the Florida Humanities Council, and they asked me to interview Goliath Davis for their magazine. And so I don't know anything about the city. I interview him, and he's telling me all about this wonderful neighborhood he grew up in called Methodist Town. And Goliath Davis was born in Methodist Town in 1950 by a midwife, Roxana Donaldson, who was married to a descendant, I think the son of John and Anna Donaldson, who were the first Black settlers in St. Pete in the late 1880s. So their son marries a woman that becomes a midwife that ends up delivering people like Goliath Davis, who in 1950, who then goes on to become the first Black police chief in St. Petersburg, and then later the deputy mayor. So Methodist Town produced like 9 PhD, doctors, and just this was really this vibrant community. And that's what I want to try and remember when I think about Methodist Town, and not just this cynical attitude of, wow, there was a bait and switch there. But I do think it's instructive for people that may be new to the city or have been here a while and don't know these stories to learn a little bit about why this topic is so fresh when we talk about Tropicana Fields redevelopment. I'm going to finish with our Jewish history because we're standing in front of this really cool building that was built in 1910, and it's become known as the Shell Dash Cottage because, let's go up and take a closer look at it, because of the finish on the building. If you get up real close to it, you can see that it's covered in stucco that has had shells thrown into it. So like here, Dex, if you can see this shell. So similar to Pebble Dash, that was a really common construction style. This was a very Florida version of Pebble Dash. So you took shells from the beach and you threw them in the wet stucco, and it gave it kind of this nice finish. This was built in 1910 by Perry Snell, actually, probably as a model home for the Lakeview subdivision that was built on Mirror Lake. So we're on the east side of 9th Street, MLK. So this was a very white neighborhood over here. The reason I wanted to finish here was because some of the earliest residents, probably the second or third residents of this house, were Leon and Olga Manket, who were the second Jewish family to live in St. Petersburg. And they owned a dry goods store just around the corner on 9th Street with her in-laws. Her parents and I believe sister lived, there used to be tall apartment complexes next door to this. And there were a number of Jewish families living right here, and then they had their shops around the corner. We won't get down there today, but just the location of Temple Bethel, which was the second Jewish congregation in St. Petersburg. So there's a lot of history in this little area of St. Pete that I think we all kind of fly by a lot and don't always think about, who kind of built the city and who those people were and the tribulations that they might have faced to become the successes that they later became and to make this city really the rich place that it is today. So thank you for joining us today. I want to say a particular thanks to, there's a great website, MethodistTown.com, I believe is the address. John will put it up on the screen, please, if you can. It's a joint project between the African American Neighborhood Association and the Neighborhood News Bureau of USF St. Pete. They have a fabulous website on Methodist Town where we got a lot of this information. I also cited a ton of resources that we'll put on the I Love the Burg website too, if you want to know more, because we really just scratched the surface of a very rich and deep topic. So thanks for joining us. We will see you next month. Bye.